In the early 1970s, the small coastal towns of Martin County, Florida, trusted one man above most others, Deputy Gerard Schaefer. He wore the badge, spoke with authority, and carried himself like someone born to enforce the law. Locals called him by the book. To his superiors, he was ambitious. To young women, he was someone they could rely on for safety. But behind that clean-cut image lay one of the darkest double lives in American policing history. Schaefer began his career as an ordinary patrolman, but colleagues would later recall that something about him always felt off. He lectured women about morality, bragged about his authority, and seemed to relish control more than service. His obsession with discipline masked an appetite for dominance. The first sign of danger came in 1972. Schaefer stopped two teenage girls hitchhiking near Hutchinson Island. Instead of warning them about safety, he told them the roads were full of predators and offered to teach them how to avoid danger. He took them to a remote area, tied them to trees, and threatened to kill them. By sheer luck, he was called away on police business and let them go, warning them never to speak. Terrified, the girls went straight to the sheriff. The sheriff, stunned, suspended Schaefer immediately. Within days, the deputy was arrested and charged with false imprisonment and assault. But the community couldn't believe it. A deputy accused of abducting girls. Many dismissed it as a misunderstanding. Schaefer paid bail, insisting it was a training exercise gone wrong. Then, before the case could even go to trial, two other girls, Susan Place and Georgia Jessup, vanished from the same area. They had last been seen near a local bridge where Schaefer often patrolled. Months later, a fisherman stumbled upon bones deep in the mangroves. Investigators discovered jewelry, clothing fragments, and remains tied to trees, eerily similar to the description the earlier victims had given of their ordeal. Dental records confirmed the worst. The remains belonged to Place and Jessup. The evidence against Schaefer began to snowball. Witnesses placed him near the scene. His car matched one spotted near the girl's last known location. And when detectives searched his home, what they found turned suspicion into horror. Women's jewelry, purses, personal items, and hundreds of pages of handwritten fantasies, detailed accounts of abduction, torture, and murder. Some matched real cases of missing women across Florida. To his neighbors, Schaefer had been the friendly deputy. To investigators, he was something else entirely, a man who had used his uniform as bait. His victims trusted him precisely because of the badge he wore. When the news broke, Florida was stunned. A man hired to uphold the law had allegedly turned his patrol car into a mobile trap. Reporters called him the killer cop. Prosecutors began quietly reopening cold cases, wondering how many missing women's names might appear in his notebooks. By the time Schaefer's trial approached, it was clear this wasn't just a case of a deputy gone rogue. It was the story of a predator who had learned that the surest way to gain a victim's trust was to impersonate authority. Except Schaefer didn't have to pretend. He was authority, and that made him unstoppable until his own arrogance caught up with him. When investigators opened Gerard Schaefer's notebooks, they expected evidence. What they found instead were nightmares written in police handwriting. Hundreds of pages, neatly typed and dated, described abductions, mutilations, and killings in chilling detail, sometimes written as fiction, sometimes as diary entries. Detectives realized they weren't reading stories. They were reading a man's memories disguised as imagination. The search of Schaefer's home yielded a disturbing catalogue of trophies, jewelry, driver's licenses, hair clips, and underwear belonging to missing young women. Each item represented a life that had vanished without a trace. Some objects matched active missing persons cases stretching across Florida. Others were never linked to any identified victim, silent evidence of how far his crimes might have reached. Forensic teams began to cross-reference everything. Soil samples from his backyard matched earth found near the mangrove dump site. Bone fragments and teeth recovered from multiple counties suggested a pattern too deliberate to ignore. And then came the writings. In one manuscript titled Confessions of a Serial Killer, Schaefer described abducting girls, hanging them upside down, and teaching them the price of disobedience. When questioned, Schaefer laughed. He claimed it was all fiction, creative writing for a novel he planned to publish. Writers have to imagine things, he told detectives. But his details were too precise. The knots, the locations, the exact words spoken to victims, all mirrored what survivors had described. Prosecutors charged him with the murders of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup, but quietly suspected dozens more. During trial in 1973, jurors sat through weeks of testimony that peeled back the image of the lawman and exposed the predator beneath. Colleagues admitted they had ignored his odd behavior, his obsession with discipline, his habit of driving alone to remote patrol zones, his rants about immoral women. One officer recalled him saying, "If I ever killed anyone, nobody would know. I'm the one who writes the reports." The defense tried to portray him as eccentric but harmless, arguing that no one could link him to the other disappearances beyond circumstantial evidence. But the physical proof, the jewelry, the bone matches, and the diaries spoke louder. The jury needed only a few hours to convict him on both murder counts. The judge handed down 2 life sentences, calling Schaefer a disgrace to every honest badge. Behind bars, Schaefer became a manipulative celebrity. He wrote letters to journalists, bragged about killing more than Ted Bundy ever dreamed of. In one correspondence, he hinted at 30 to 80 victims. Authorities never confirmed the full number, but cold case detectives continued to find echoes of his methods in unsolved disappearances from the early 1970s. In 1995, after 2 decades in prison, Schaefer's story ended the same way many of his victims' lives had, violently. Another inmate stabbed him to death in his cell. His death closed a chapter, but not the questions. To this day, investigators believe Gerard Schaefer may have been one of America's earliest law enforcement serial killers, a man who weaponized the very symbol of safety to hunt those who trusted it most. The badge had shielded him, the authority had enabled him, and the darkness beneath had gone unnoticed until it was too late. In the annals of American crime, his name stands as a warning. When power and perversion share a uniform, even justice itself can become a trap. In the spring of 1995, New Orleans was already a city under strain. Police corruption scandals, rising crime, and a fragile trust between officers and the communities they served. But nothing could have prepared the city for what one of its own would do next. Antoinette Frank, a 23-year-old patrol officer once praised for her ambition, would shatter that trust in a single night of betrayal and bloodshed. Frank had joined the New Orleans Police Department just 2 years earlier. To the public, she was proof that hard work could elevate anyone, even in a force plagued by controversy. But inside the department, her behavior raised quiet alarms. Fellow officers described her as erratic and volatile. She skipped training sessions, clashed with superiors, and often bragged about using her badge to get favors. Still, few imagined what she was capable of. At a small Vietnamese restaurant called Kim An's, the owners and staff knew Frank not as a police officer, but as a friend. She was a frequent visitor, often eating meals there and chatting with the family's children. The restaurant's workers trusted her so much that they even let her come in after hours. That trust would cost them their lives. On the night of March 4th, Frank was deep in financial trouble and saw the family-run business as an easy target. Wearing her uniform, she and Lucchese arrived after closing time. The sight of her badge disarmed the staff's suspicions. Within minutes, the robbery turned to chaos. Inside, 3 people were murdered, 2 teenage siblings, Ha and Kwong Vu, and Officer Ronald Williams, a fellow NYPD patrolman who had been working security that night. Investigators would later determine that Frank shot her own colleague point blank, then helped execute the children she'd once promised to protect. The only survivor was the restaurant's owner, who had hidden in a back room and watched the nightmare unfold. When police arrived, they found Williams's body sprawled near the doorway, his service weapon missing. The Vu siblings were discovered in a storage area. The killer had fled in Williams's patrol car, a move that would later prove catastrophic for Frank. Within hours, the department realized one of its own vehicles was missing, and Frank's name appeared on the shift logs. Detectives began piecing the puzzle together quickly. Surveillance footage placed her near the scene. Witnesses reported seeing her return to the restaurant earlier that day, as if casing it. Her story to investigators shifted repeatedly, first claiming she'd stopped by the restaurant for food, then insisting she'd been home asleep. Each lie pulled her deeper into suspicion. When confronted, Frank showed little emotion. Colleagues who interviewed her described her demeanor as cold and oddly confident. One detective said it felt like questioning someone who believed the badge made her untouchable. But forensic evidence told a different story. Gunpowder residue matched her service weapon, and ballistic tests tied bullets from the scene directly to her pistol. Within 2 days, Antoinette Frank and Rogers Lucchese were arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The image of her, a young black woman in uniform, handcuffed and expressionless, appeared on front pages across America. For a city already wary of its police, it was confirmation of the worst fear imaginable, that even the symbol of protection could turn into a weapon. As the news spread, the question echoed through New Orleans: what makes someone sworn to defend life decide to take it instead? When Antoinette Frank walked into the Orleans parish courtroom in the summer of 1995, the city that once cheered her uniform now stared in disbelief. The same badge that had earned her entry into homes, restaurants, and lives had become the ultimate mark of betrayal. She was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder for killing Officer Ronald Williams and siblings Ha and Kwong Vu inside Kim Un's restaurant. The case against her would reveal greed, manipulation, and a level of arrogance that shocked even seasoned prosecutors. The prosecution's evidence was airtight. Ballistics experts testified that bullets recovered from the victims' bodies matched Frank's service weapon. Gunpowder residue was found on her hands and uniform. And most damning of all, surviving witnesses described seeing her return to the restaurant twice that night, first before the robbery, and again just moments before the massacre. The family's father, Hung Vu, who had hidden during the attack, identified her voice in the darkness as the gunfire began. Prosecutors painted Frank as a cold opportunist who used her authority as a shield. She wasn't coerced, they argued. She planned everything. Financial records showed she was drowning in debt. Testimonies from colleagues revealed a pattern of misconduct, using her badge for free meals, borrowing money from suspects, falsifying timesheets. She saw the badge not as a duty, the district attorney said in closing, but as a weapon and a key. Her co-defendant, Rogers Lucchese, claimed Frank had orchestrated the robbery and convinced him it would be easy, just scare them and take the money. But Frank flipped the narrative, telling jurors that Lucchese was the killer and she had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The jury didn't believe her. The most haunting testimony came when prosecutors displayed photographs of Officer Williams, shot with his own weapon. Several officers in the courtroom wept openly. The department had lost one of its own, not to a criminal, but to one wearing the same uniform. In less than 2 hours, the jury returned its verdict, guilty on all counts. The judge called her crimes a calculated act of betrayal and sentenced her to death by lethal injection. It was one of the rare instances in U.S. history where a female police officer received a death sentence. The years that followed turned Frank's name into a case study in corruption. Appeals dragged on, but the evidence never wavered. In prison, she maintained her innocence, at times claiming she was framed by a crooked system. Yet letters she wrote to Lucchese betrayed her, filled with affection and regret for getting caught, not remorse for the victims. As public outrage faded, her case left behind a deeper wound. The psychological toll of knowing a uniform no longer guaranteed safety. The New Orleans Police Department faced intense scrutiny. Reports surfaced that supervisors had overlooked red flags, her erratic behavior, her financial desperation, even complaints about her aggression toward civilians. In later years, Frank's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment without parole. She remains at the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women, rarely speaking to the press. Lucchese, too, sits behind bars for life. But the echoes of that night in 1995 still haunt the city. For every officer who puts their life on the line with honor, her name stands as a scar on the badge, proof that power, in the wrong hands, can turn protection into predation. Because when the law itself pulls the trigger, who is left to uphold justice? In 2014, Oklahoma City faced a case that would redefine how America viewed trust in law enforcement. At the center of it was Daniel Holtzclaw, a 27-year-old patrol officer once celebrated as a hometown success story, a former college football player turned cop, known for his discipline and physical presence. To the community, he looked like the model officer. To his victims, he would become something else entirely, a predator with a badge. Holtzclaw patrolled the city's northeast side, an area largely made up of poor minority neighborhoods. Many residents lived in fear of police interactions, and that fear was exactly what he exploited. During late-night patrols, he would stop women walking home, often accusing them of petty crimes, drugs, warrants, or stolen property. But these weren't arrests, they were ambushes. Behind the safety of his uniform, Holtzclaw allegedly demanded sexual acts in exchange for freedom. Most of the women were black, poor, and already distrustful of the system. Some had criminal records or histories of addiction, making them unlikely to be believed if they ever spoke out. Holtzclaw counted on that silence. He treated vulnerability as opportunity, carefully choosing those he believed no one would defend. For months, his pattern went unnoticed. Supervisors praised his activity levels, unaware that many of his traffic stops and pedestrian checks weren't logged correctly. His authority shielded him. The uniform, the patrol car, the badge, all gave him the power to isolate women in the dark, to make every encounter sound procedural on paper. But everything began to unravel in June 2014, when one woman, Janie Liggins, refused to stay silent. She told investigators that during a late-night stop, Holtzclaw had forced her into an assault, threatening jail time if she resisted. Unlike others, she reported him immediately. Detectives believed her enough to begin a quiet investigation, installing GPS trackers on Holtzclaw's patrol car, reviewing his shift logs, and cross-checking traffic stop data. What they found was staggering. Multiple women in the same neighborhoods had reported nearly identical experiences, being pulled over for no reason, taken behind buildings or into patrol cars, and violated. All described the same man, tall, muscular, with an authoritative voice and a calm, commanding tone. Investigators realized they weren't dealing with isolated incidents. They were looking at a pattern, a serial predator operating under color of law. When Internal Affairs brought Holtzclaw in for questioning, his confidence never wavered. He denied everything, insisting the accusations came from unreliable women trying to ruin a good cop. But the data didn't lie. His GPS logs matched the time and place of each woman's account. Body cam footage from other shifts captured how he targeted lone women, speaking to them in tones that blurred authority and coercion. Within weeks, Holtzclaw was arrested. Prosecutors described his crimes as a systematic abuse of power, rape by law enforcement authority. The charges stacked fast, 36 felony counts, including sexual battery, assault, and kidnapping. The community was torn. Some residents defended him, others demanded justice. As media coverage intensified, the image of Holtzclaw, the athlete-turned-officer, began to collapse. What emerged instead was the face of a predator who had learned that a badge can be the perfect disguise. He had sworn to protect, but his protection was a lie, and the streets he patrolled would soon become the courtroom that exposed him. The trial of Daniel Holtzclaw was unlike anything Oklahoma City had seen. It wasn't just about a police officer accused of assault. It was about power itself, and how far it could be abused when wrapped in a badge. Over 7 weeks, prosecutors built a case that peeled back the layers of intimidation, manipulation, and deceit that had allowed him to operate undetected for months. The prosecution called 13 women, each telling a story that echoed the others almost word for word. Late-night traffic stops, flashing patrol lights, the quiet threat of handcuffs or jail, then coercion. Each woman described the same pattern, Holtzclaw using his position to exploit them, confident they would never speak. Prosecutors were careful. They knew jurors might doubt the credibility of women with troubled pasts. Some had criminal records, others had histories of drug use. But the similarities between their testimonies were impossible to ignore. He knew exactly who he could silence, one prosecutor said, and he chose them for that reason. Then came the forensic breakthrough that changed everything. Investigators had found trace DNA, a single skin cell sample, on the inside of Holtzclaw's uniform pants, matching one of the victims who said he had assaulted her inside his patrol car. The odds of that DNA belonging to anyone else were astronomical. It was the scientific anchor the jury needed, proof that this wasn't just testimony, it was evidence written in biology. The defense fought back aggressively. Holtzclaw's attorneys claimed the accusations were coordinated, the DNA contaminated, the women motivated by fame or financial settlement. They painted him as a scapegoat in an era of rising anger against police misconduct. But every counter-argument collapsed under the weight of pattern and precision. The GPS records, the body cam review, the night shift logs, all aligned with the victims' accounts. As testimony continued, Holtzclaw's demeanor shifted from defiant to hollow. The once proud officer who had flexed in police photos now sat motionless, eyes downcast, as jurors listened to the women describe how he had turned the shield of the law into a weapon. On December 10, 2015, after 4 days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict, guilty on 18 of 36 counts, including rape, sexual battery, and forcible oral sodomy. The courtroom fell silent as the judge announced the sentence, 263 years in prison. It was effectively a life sentence, a number meant to outlast him. Outside, the public reaction split the city in two. Some hailed the verdict as justice finally served. Others questioned whether outrage against police had influenced the outcome. But for the women who testified, it was vindication, proof that their voices mattered, even when the system itself had been used to silence them. The Holtzclaw case sparked national debate about predatory policing, how authority can disguise abuse, and how victims who fear law enforcement are often left unprotected. It forced police departments nationwide to revisit internal monitoring, data audits, and the question of accountability. Holtzclaw remains imprisoned at the Lexington Correctional Center, still maintaining his innocence. He occasionally appeals to sympathetic audiences online, claiming he was framed by the system. But for investigators, the evidence tells a clearer story, one that can't be rewritten. Because when DNA, data, and human testimony converge, they reveal a truth bigger than one man's denial. Even the strongest badge cannot hide a predator forever. New York City in the 1980s was a war zone of power. Mob families controlled unions, construction, and drugs, while the NYPD fought to keep order. But what no one expected was that two of the department's own detectives, Stephen Caracappa and Louis Eppolito, were quietly working for the enemy. They were known on the force as good cops. Both had distinguished records. Caracappa, thin and reserved, worked in the elite organized crime homicide unit. Eppolito, broad-shouldered and flamboyant, came from a long line of police officers. Together, they represented the blue-collar image of New York's finest. What no one saw was that behind closed doors, they had become paid assassins for the Lucchese crime family, the very criminals they were sworn to arrest. Their partnership began innocently enough, information for cash. A name here, a tip there. But as the Mafia war escalated, their loyalty shifted. According to later testimony, they began selling confidential police intelligence directly to Anthony "Gaspipe" Casso, the Lucchese underboss notorious for his brutality. For $4,000 a month, later raised to $10,000, the detectives provided Casso with everything he needed: surveillance targets, home addresses, even license plate numbers of suspected informants. Soon, their role expanded. They didn't just pass information, they carried out hits. In one case, they allegedly kidnapped a mobster named Jimmy Heidel, delivered him to Casso's men, and later claimed the arrest fell through. Heidel's body was never found. In another, they used their access to confidential files to identify suspected informants, who were later executed. The detectives made sure to clean the trail, falsifying reports and closing cases prematurely. By day, Caracappa and Eppolito attended award ceremonies, lectured rookies, and shook hands with mayors. By night, they were on Casso's payroll, two of the most dangerous double agents in law enforcement history. Their careers flourished even as the city bled. Eppolito published a memoir called Mafia Cop, presenting himself as a man torn between loyalty to the badge and family roots in organized crime. It was a masterstroke of misdirection. No one realized the title was truer than he ever intended. For years, they operated untouched. Their NYPD records were clean, their reputation solid. Whenever whispers emerged, internal affairs found nothing. Who would suspect two decorated detectives of working for the mob? But power breeds arrogance, and arrogance leaves cracks. Casso, during a plea deal in the 1990s, began naming names. He told the FBI that he had two cops on the payroll. At first, investigators dismissed the claim as bluster from a desperate gangster. Then details surfaced, crime scenes only NYPD insiders could have known, surveillance leaks that matched Eppolito's assignments. Slowly, the puzzle began to fit. The FBI launched a quiet operation, reopening cold cases, tracing informant leaks, and following unexplained cash deposits. What they discovered was staggering. Years of corruption hidden behind the badge, sealed with blood money. It was the perfect betrayal, not of one case, not of one victim, but of the very idea of justice itself. And soon, the entire rotten empire would collapse. By the early 2000s, the myth of Stephen Caracappa and Louis Eppolito, two model NYPD detectives who had retired quietly to Las Vegas, was beginning to unravel. What had once been whispered in backrooms of Brooklyn precincts was now the focus of an FBI task force determined to prove what seemed unthinkable. The two decorated officers had served as contract killers for the Lucchese crime family. The key came from an unlikely source, Anthony "Gaspipe" Casso, the volatile Lucchese underboss who, after years on the run, decided to talk. In 1994, during federal debriefings, Casso claimed he had 2 cops on the pad. At first, even hardened investigators dismissed the claim as the rambling of a mobster trying to bargain for leniency. But Casso's details were too precise to ignore. He knew names, dates, addresses, facts that could have come only from police files. The FBI began cross-referencing Casso's claims with old homicide records. They noticed an eerie pattern. Several mob hits had been carried out with uncanny precision, often within days of confidential law enforcement briefings. Surveillance targets vanished. Informants were murdered hours after their protection details were reassigned. It was as if someone inside the department was feeding the mob in real time. Then came the money trail. Financial analysts discovered deposits and property transactions linked to Eppolito's family, small but steady cash flows that couldn't be explained by his pension. Investigators traced the funds back to accounts connected to Lucchese intermediaries. Meanwhile, forensic accountants found coded notes and ledger entries in seized mob records that referred to the cops as reliable assets. In 2005, the FBI finally made its move. Agents raided Eppolito's Las Vegas home, a lavish property decorated with police memorabilia and framed commendations. In the safe, they found a treasure trove of evidence, forged documents, fake IDs, and a coded notebook that referenced names of murdered informants and payoffs. When cross-checked with Caracappa's files, the overlap was undeniable. The case that had haunted federal agents for a decade was now ironclad. The arrests shocked the nation. 2 former NYPD detectives, men once hailed for their heroism, were now accused of using the badge as a hitman's license. Prosecutors charged them with racketeering, murder, extortion, and conspiracy, describing them as the most corrupt cops in American history. In court, the defense tried to paint Casso as unreliable, a manipulative killer willing to say anything to reduce his sentence. But the prosecution didn't rely on Casso's word alone. They presented forensic timelines, internal police memos, and FBI wiretaps that showed how Caracappa and Eppolito leaked information about witnesses and even carried out mob killings themselves. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was a wiretapped conversation between 2 Lucchese associates reminiscing about our cops who made people disappear. The laughter on the tape silenced the courtroom. In 2006, after a 6-week trial, both men were convicted on all major counts. The judge called their crimes a betrayal beyond comprehension. Caracappa received life plus 80 years. Eppolito got the same. Both were ordered to die in prison. Their downfall sent shockwaves through law enforcement. For decades, they had attended the same ceremonies, worn the same uniforms, and sworn the same oath as thousands of honest officers. But behind that blue wall, they had turned justice into business, trading lives for envelopes of cash. Caracappa died in prison in 2017. Eppolito followed 2 years later. Neither man ever admitted guilt, but the legacy of their crimes endures, a dark reminder that corruption doesn't always come from the outside. Sometimes, it wears the badge itself. Because when trust becomes a weapon, even the protectors can become predators. On the surface, David Brame embodied the image of a modern American police chief, disciplined, articulate, and the youngest person ever appointed to lead the Tacoma Police Department. To his officers, he was the man who had risen through the ranks by hard work and charm. To the public, he was the face of safety. But behind closed doors, the reality of his home life was collapsing into something dark and violent. In the spring of 2003, Tacoma's headlines began to shift tone. Whispers of a bitter divorce between Chief Brame and his wife, Crystal, started surfacing. She had filed for legal separation, alleging emotional and physical abuse, and confided to friends that she feared for her safety. To outsiders, the claims were hard to reconcile. Brame was a respected official, a lawman in command of hundreds, praised for community policing. But those closest to Crystal saw the fear in her eyes every time she mentioned his name. Behind the facade of authority, Brame's control extended beyond the station. Court documents later revealed years of coercion and psychological manipulation, incidents where he allegedly isolated Crystal from family, monitored her movements, and used his badge as a shield against accountability. "Who would believe you over me?" he once reportedly told her. It wasn't an idle threat. As the divorce proceedings turned bitter, Brame's behavior grew erratic. Colleagues noticed his short temper and distracted focus. Yet few imagined the depths of the crisis building inside the city's top cop.
even when Crystal's attorney wrote directly to Tacoma's city manager, warning that Brame's position of power could endanger her. No formal investigation followed.
Then came April 26, 2003, a clear Saturday afternoon at a shopping center parking lot in Gig Harbor. Witnesses later described seeing a man and woman arguing beside a car. Within seconds, gunfire echoed. When officers arrived, they found Chief David Brame, 44, dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Nearby, Crystal Brame, 35, lay critically wounded. She died 2 days later in the hospital. The shock was seismic. The chief of police, the man tasked with protecting families, had murdered his wife in public before taking his own life. The community that had once celebrated his leadership was plunged into mourning and disbelief. City officials scrambled to explain how someone with such a violent personal history had risen unchecked through the department's ranks. In the following days, details poured out. Internal complaints that had gone unreviewed, colleagues who had heard rumors but stayed silent, supervisors who looked the other way. The image of Tacoma's model chief shattered overnight. As vigils formed outside police headquarters, the question that hung over every candlelit gathering was one of betrayal. How could a man trusted to enforce the law turn it into a weapon against his own family? The Brame tragedy exposed something deeper than one officer's rage. It revealed the culture of silence that can fester within law enforcement when accountability stops at the badge. And soon, that silence would face the full weight of investigation. The murder-suicide of Chief David Brame sent the city of Tacoma into chaos. It wasn't just grief, it was disbelief mixed with fury. A man trusted to lead a department of hundreds had turned his service weapon on his own wife. Now, as reporters crowded the courthouse steps and protesters demanded answers, the city's leadership realized this was no longer a private tragedy. It was a public reckoning. Within days, investigators discovered a paper trail that should have stopped Brame long before that April afternoon. Internal complaints, some dating back years, painted a pattern of aggression, intimidation, and unstable behavior. Former colleagues admitted off record that they had heard stories of his temper, at home, in meetings, even on patrol, but few had dared to challenge him. "You don't go against the chief," one officer later said. "Not if you want to keep your job." Civil suits quickly followed. Crystal's parents filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the city of Tacoma, alleging it had ignored warnings about Brame's violence and psychological instability. They argued that by promoting him to chief, despite multiple red flags, city officials had placed both Crystal and the public in danger. As discovery unfolded, damning details emerged. A psychologist who had once evaluated Brame during his application to the police academy had expressed serious concerns about his mental state. Internal affairs files showed earlier domestic violence allegations that were quietly dropped, and fellow officers acknowledged knowing about the couple's explosive arguments, but had been told to stay out of it. The fallout forced resignations at the highest levels. Tacoma's city manager and several top officials stepped down. The state's governor ordered a formal review into domestic violence within law enforcement, a problem that advocates had long claimed was hidden behind institutional walls. For the first time, police departments nationwide were forced to confront an uncomfortable question. What happens when the person trained to respond to domestic abuse becomes the abuser? National networks broadcast the Brame case for months. Experts on policing and trauma spoke openly about the blue shield of silence, a culture where officers protected one another, even when warning signs turned deadly. Women married to police officers began contacting support organizations, sharing eerily similar experiences of intimidation and fear. The conversation expanded from Tacoma to Washington, D.C., where lawmakers began drafting reforms. By 2004, the David Brame Domestic Violence Prevention Act was signed into law in Washington state. It required police departments to establish clear protocols for handling domestic abuse allegations involving officers, including mandatory reporting, firearm removal, and mental health evaluations. Training programs were introduced nationwide, emphasizing that accountability didn't end at the precinct door. For Crystal Brame's family, the legal victories were bittersweet. Settlements and policy changes couldn't bring back their daughter, but they had forced the justice system to face its blind spot. Her father later said, "If a police chief's wife can't be protected, what chance does an ordinary woman have?" That question became the driving force behind advocacy groups dedicated to reform. Today, David Brame's name stands as a warning, not just about one man's violence, but about how unchecked authority can incubate it. His badge, once a symbol of protection, became the emblem of betrayal. The parking lot where the shooting occurred remains a quiet place now. A small plaque nearby bears Crystal's name, a reminder that the cost of silence is always higher than the cost of accountability. In the shadow of Chicago's skyline, under the hum of flickering fluorescent lights in police interrogation rooms, something sinister unfolded for nearly 2 decades, and the man at its center was Commander John Burge. To the public, he was a decorated Vietnam veteran turned lawman, celebrated for his toughness and high confession rates. To those who sat across from him in the cramped, windowless rooms of Area 2 headquarters, he was something else entirely, a name whispered in fear. It began quietly in the early 1970s, when Burge joined the Chicago Police Department's detective unit. His reputation rose fast. Colleagues described him as sharp, fearless, a cop's cop. But behind that reputation, whispers grew of confessions extracted under questionable circumstances. Men, mostly black, often young, and nearly all from Chicago's South Side, began telling eerily similar stories after leaving Burge's custody. Stories of electric shocks, suffocation with typewriter covers, burns, mock executions, and brutal beatings. For years, no one believed them. Judges dismissed the claims as desperate lies from guilty men. Burge's cases continued to pile up, over 200 confessions, many leading to life sentences or death row. He earned commendations, promotions, and the rank of commander by the mid-1980s. But inside communities already scarred by racial tension and distrust, the legend of Burge took on a darker meaning. People called it the Midnight Crew, a circle of detectives who, under his command, made pain their investigative tool. By the late 1980s, the stories began to break into the open. Attorneys for wrongfully convicted men noticed the patterns, the same officers' names, the same injuries, the same hospital records. One man, Andrew Wilson, who had been accused of killing 2 officers, showed burns that doctors said could have come only from electric current applied to the body. His account, being shocked by wires clipped to his ears and genitals, mirrored earlier statements from others. Still, the department circled its wagons. Burge denied everything, calling the allegations fiction invented by criminals. Internal Affairs quietly investigated but never brought charges. In 1991, amid mounting pressure from journalists and activists, the department finally suspended Burge. But even then, the focus was limited. The official inquiry labeled it isolated misconduct, not a pattern. He was fired 2 years later, but never criminally charged for the alleged torture itself. For the victims, it was a devastating betrayal. Dozens of men had been sent to prison on confessions extracted under duress. Some remained on death row for crimes they claimed they hadn't committed. Activists and lawyers, including those from the People's Law Office, refused to let the story die. They filed civil suits, uncovered old interrogation logs, and pressed for the release of long-buried internal memos that proved higher-ups had known about the abuse for years. As the 1990s closed, the Chicago torture scandal was no longer just rumor. It was a matter of record. The city that had celebrated John Burge as a hero was now forced to confront the truth. For nearly 2 decades, its police had operated an off-the-books regime of torture, protected by silence and fear. But the reckoning was far from over. The victims wanted justice, and Burge still walked free. The next chapter would expose the depth of the cover-up, the political cost of complicity, and how the fight for accountability would span decades, reaching from courtroom benches to City Hall itself. When John Burge was finally fired from the Chicago Police Department in 1993, many thought the story would end there, a disgraced commander quietly fading into retirement. But for the dozens of men who had screamed through his interrogations, it was only the beginning. Their voices, once dismissed as the cries of criminals, were about to become the foundation of one of the most explosive civil rights reckonings in American law enforcement history. Attorneys began unearthing documents long buried in the city's archives. Internal memos revealed that city attorneys, police supervisors, and even top officials had known for years that Burge's Midnight Crew used torture to extract confessions. One report from the late 1980s, suppressed for years, had described the abuse in chilling detail: beatings, burns, and electric shocks administered to suspects tied to radiators or chairs. It was no longer just accusation, it was evidence. The cover-up stretched high. For decades, judges, prosecutors, and mayors had turned away from mounting proof. Political careers had been built on convictions Burge's unit delivered. Reopening those cases meant reopening the city's own credibility. But one by one, the wrongfully convicted began to walk free. Men like Anthony Porter, Leroy Orange, and Madison Hobley, whose exonerations exposed a system that had preferred silence to justice. By the 2000s, the scandal had reached national attention. Civil rights attorneys launched a wave of lawsuits against the city, arguing that Chicago had protected a known torturer. Depositions and testimonies painted a horrifying picture. Burge as the architect of an unofficial torture regime, his detectives carrying out his methods, and supervisors rewarding results without asking how they were obtained. But there was a problem. The statute of limitations had expired for the torture itself. Burge could not be criminally charged for the acts of brutality that took place in the 1970s and 1980s. So prosecutors found another way. They charged him with perjury and obstruction of justice, alleging that he had lied under oath during civil suits when he denied participating in or knowing about the torture. It was a narrow legal window, but it was enough. In 2010, nearly 40 years after the first victims were tortured, John Burge was convicted in federal court. During sentencing, the judge called his actions a disgrace to the badge and a betrayal of the very ideals he had sworn to uphold. Burge received 4.5 years in prison, a fraction of what his victims had endured, but symbolically monumental. The city of Chicago, facing enormous public pressure, took a step few American cities ever had. In 2015, it formally acknowledged the torture program and established a $5.5 million reparations fund for survivors. Each recognized victim received compensation, access to counseling, and educational benefits for their families. The city also mandated that the Chicago public schools teach the history of Burge's crimes, ensuring that what happened in those interrogation rooms would never again be hidden. Still, the legacy of the scandal lingers. Over 100 cases tied to Burge's command were reviewed, dozens of convictions overturned. Generations of Chicagoans grew up distrusting the police, scars left by decades of institutional denial. Burge himself, stripped of his pension, but never apologetic, died in 2018, unrepentant to the end. The Chicago torture scandal stands as a grim monument in policing history, not just for the brutality committed, but for the silence that sustained it. It forced America to confront a truth few wanted to admit, that power without accountability breeds not protection, but corruption. And for those who lived through Burge's era, justice came late, but it came with names, numbers, and a promise etched into law: never again. In early 2000s Britain, Detective Inspector Wayne Sanderson was a name that carried weight. He was the officer you called when a case needed closing, the investigator who always got his man. Colleagues praised his instincts, the press called him relentless, and in a department measured by conviction rates, his numbers looked immaculate. But behind that sterling record was a truth far darker, a detective who had built his legacy not on justice, but on manipulation. Sanderson worked in the Midlands Serious Crime Unit, a division tasked with tackling complex investigations, robberies, assaults, and the occasional murder. His reputation grew from his ability to turn weak cases into courtroom wins. Prosecutors adored him. His reports were clean, concise, persuasive. Too persuasive. Defense solicitors began whispering that his files always seemed to contain the perfect piece of evidence, the convenient witness statement, or the unshakable forensic link that arrived just in time to secure a guilty plea. It took years for anyone to question it. Police culture rewarded results, not process. Sanderson's career flourished, commendations, promotions, even a Queen's Police Medal nomination. But then, one case cracked the facade. In 2000, when new forensic testing techniques were applied, the supposed match evaporated. The sample had been contaminated, or worse, planted. The audit didn't stop there. Independent forensic analysts began re-examining dozens of Sanderson's old cases. Patterns emerged, chain of custody anomalies, inconsistent timestamps, identical phrasing across multiple witness statements, allegedly written years apart. It was as if someone had been building narratives rather than discovering facts. A whistleblower inside the forensics department finally came forward. She testified that Sanderson often visited the evidence lab alone after hours, under the pretense of urgent case updates. When questioned, he brushed it off as dedication. But emails uncovered during an internal probe told a different story. They revealed direct interference with digital evidence, altered report metadata, and even instructions to junior officers to make sure it fits. By 2009, what began as a quiet internal review exploded into a full criminal inquiry. Sanderson, the department's pride, was suspended and charged with perverting the course of justice, falsifying evidence, and misconduct in public office. The trial was devastating for British policing. In court, prosecutors described a man obsessed with winning, someone who saw confession and conviction as trophies, not truth. Over 20 past convictions were overturned during proceedings, with several innocent men released from prison. One, in tears outside the courthouse, said, "He didn't just take my years, he took my name." Forensic experts testified to finding falsified data entries in the National Evidence Database. Witnesses described being coached, pressured, even threatened into making statements that aligned with Sanderson's narrative. The judge called it a betrayal so complete it corrodes faith in justice itself. Sanderson was convicted and sentenced to 12 years in prison, his award stripped, his record expunged. The damage, however, was irreversible. Every case he had ever touched became suspect. Public trust in the police, already fragile after earlier scandals, plummeted further. A nationwide review followed, forcing departments across the UK to introduce independent evidence verification systems and limit sole access to digital forensic databases. When Sanderson was finally led away in cuffs, reporters shouted questions. Did he regret it? He said nothing. Only later, in letters intercepted by journalists, did he write, "Justice is about results. I just made sure justice happened faster." For a man who once embodied the power of the badge, it was the ultimate irony that in chasing perfect convictions, he had convicted the innocent and condemned the system itself. In Australia's 1980s political landscape, Keith Wright was the picture of respectability, a lawmaker, a teacher by training, and a former police volunteer who championed family values. To his constituents in Queensland, he was the voice of morality, often invoking faith and discipline in speeches about protecting children and restoring decency in public life. But beneath the sermons and smiles lay a truth that would one day horrify the very people who elected him. Before entering politics, Wright had worked briefly as a volunteer within the police auxiliary system, an experience he would later cite as proof of his commitment to law and order. As a member of Parliament, he rose quickly, becoming the leader of the Queensland Labour Party in the early 1980s. Newspapers described him as charismatic, articulate, and deeply religious. He visited schools, gave talks on ethics, and positioned himself as a guardian of youth. Then came the accusations, quiet at first, whispered among families who had known him through church and education programs. Parents began to suspect something was wrong. Young girls who had attended Wright's community events reported inappropriate advances, private meetings, and threats disguised as mentorship. For years, the stories went nowhere. The power gap was too large. Wright was a respected politician, untouchable and adored by many. But in the late 1980s, the facade began to crumble. One brave survivor came forward, detailing repeated abuse that had begun when she was just a teenager. Her account matched those of others who soon followed. The allegations spanned years and settings, private tutoring sessions, political offices, even church gatherings. Each story echoed the same pattern of manipulation, Wright using authority, religion, and trust as tools of control. Police investigations followed, and what they found stripped away every illusion of morality he had built his career on. Testimonies revealed systematic grooming, emotional coercion, and intimidation. He had used his position not only to exploit but to silence. When detectives raided his property, they found diaries and letters in which he justified his actions in chillingly calculated language, claiming spiritual connection and mutual understanding. The trial that followed in 1993 was one of Australia's most watched political scandals. The prosecution's case was brutal in its precision. Multiple victims took the stand, describing years of trauma masked by fear and shame. Psychologists testified that Wright's pattern of abuse was consistent with predatory grooming masked by religious and moral authority. The defense tried to frame the case as politically motivated, but the weight of evidence was overwhelming. When the verdict came, Wright was convicted on multiple counts of indecent dealing and sexual assault of minors. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison. For Queenslanders who had once voted for him, it felt like betrayal on 2 levels, first of trust and second of faith. Yet even behind bars, Wright refused to accept guilt. He began writing essays from prison, publishing reflections that blurred repentance with denial. In one piece, he suggested he had been misunderstood, framing his crimes as misguided affection. The writings sparked outrage across Australia and were later used by psychologists as textbook examples of narcissistic self-justification among offenders in positions of power. The scandal had ripple effects beyond the courtroom. Australia's political and law enforcement communities faced intense scrutiny over how such a man could rise unchecked. His case became one of the catalysts for tightening background checks and for introducing stricter vetting of individuals in child-related or public trust positions, policies that would later expand into the national Working with Children check. Wright served his sentence and was released quietly, largely shunned by the public he once led. He lived out his final years in obscurity, a fallen moral crusader who had built his image on protecting innocence while destroying it behind closed doors. In the end, Keith Wright's name became shorthand for hypocrisy at its most corrosive, a reminder that sometimes the loudest voices preaching morality are the ones who fear their own reflection. In the hierarchy of criminals who've humiliated law enforcement, Richard Lee McNair sits near the top, not because of violence or chaos, but because of his almost unbelievable ability to slip through the cracks of every system meant to contain him. Between the 1980s and 2000s, this small-town man from North Dakota became a living embarrassment for American policing, escaping custody not once, not twice, but 3 times, each time using nothing more than charm, cunning, and a calmness that defied logic. McNair's story began like many career criminal tales: petty thefts, break-ins, and an escalating disregard for rules. But in 1987, the petty crime turned fatal. During a warehouse burglary, McNair shot and killed truck driver Jerry Thies while trying to flee the scene. Convicted of murder and attempted escape, he was sentenced to 2 life terms plus 30 years, a punishment meant to ensure he'd never walk free again. But the system had underestimated the man's mind. His first escape came almost immediately. While held in a local police station, McNair used lip balm, yes, chapstick, to slide his wrists free from handcuffs and crawl out through a ventilation shaft. He was caught hours later, hiding in an empty building nearby. Authorities laughed it off, a clever but harmless stunt from a desperate man. They wouldn't laugh for long. 2 years later, while in state prison, McNair pulled off something far more audacious. Assigned to a prison workshop repairing mailbags, he began quietly constructing his own escape vehicle, a mailbag pallet big enough to hide himself inside. On April 5, 1988, he climbed in, sealed the bag, and waited as prison staff unknowingly loaded him onto a truck headed out of the facility. When workers opened the shipment hours later, he was gone. For months, McNair drifted across the country under false names, working odd jobs and blending into small towns. He avoided capture until a police officer recognized him during a routine check. Once again, he was taken back into custody, this time under maximum security. The system swore it had learned its lesson. But McNair wasn't finished. Fast forward to 2006, inside the federal penitentiary in Pollock, Louisiana. McNair, now in his late 40s, was known as quiet, polite, even helpful, the kind of inmate guards stopped worrying about. Assigned to a prison workshop refurbishing mailbags, he recognized an old opportunity. For weeks, he prepared. Using industrial shrink wrap, cardboard, and tape, he constructed a hollow pallet, tested it for oxygen flow, and timed the loading schedules. Then, one afternoon, he zipped himself in. Hours later, as the truck rolled through the gates, McNair rode out of one of the most secure prisons in America, hidden among mailbags once again. By the time the staff counted heads, he was already miles away. What happened next cemented his legend. Weeks after his escape, a New Mexico state trooper pulled over a man jogging near the highway. The dashcam captured the entire exchange, a calm, friendly chat between the officer and McNair, who introduced himself as a traveling salesman. The officer, noticing nothing suspicious, let him go. The footage later went viral when McNair was recaptured, showing a fugitive literally talking his way out of capture on camera. It took 18 months and a multinational manhunt to finally end his run. He was found in a small town in Canada, living under an alias, working quietly in a grain elevator. When captured, McNair was polite, even cooperative, a man who seemed to view his escapes as puzzles, not crimes. Psychologists later called him a high-functioning sociopath, while law enforcement used his case in training manuals about procedural lapses. He had exploited every weakness: complacency, routine, trust. His story forced a nationwide review of prison transport procedures and evidence handling security. Today, Richard Lee McNair remains behind bars in a Supermax facility, where escape is nearly impossible. Yet his story endures, not as a tale of violence, but as a study in how one man's patience and intellect exposed just how fragile authority can be when it underestimates the human mind. Abuse of power isn't bound by borders. From Europe to Asia, from wartime officers to modern-day officials, history keeps repeating the same unsettling truth, that when authority goes unchecked, it can twist from protection into persecution. 3 stories from 3 corners of the world prove just how deeply that betrayal can run. Laszlo Csatari, Hungary's ghost of the past. For decades, he lived quietly under a new name in Budapest, a polite, soft-spoken man who blended into the rhythm of post-war Europe. But behind the ordinary facade was Laszlo Csatari, a former Hungarian police officer accused of orchestrating some of the most brutal deportations of World War II. In 1944, during the Nazi occupation, Csatari served as a senior officer overseeing a Jewish ghetto in Košice, now part of Slovakia. Survivors later testified that he personally selected prisoners for transport to Auschwitz, beating those who resisted. More than 15,000 people were sent to their deaths under his watch. After the war, Csatari was convicted in absentia for war crimes but fled Europe, eventually settling in Canada under a false identity. For over 50 years, he evaded justice. Then, in 2012, a report by the Simon Wiesenthal Center exposed his true identity. The revelation shocked Europe, an unpunished war criminal living openly in modern Budapest. He was arrested and charged, but age and illness intervened. Csatari died in 2013 before trial could begin. His case became a haunting reminder of how time and bureaucracy often protect those who once weaponized authority. Guo Ping, the enforcer who became the corrupt in China. The irony was almost poetic. Guo Ping, a senior officer in the country's anti-corruption bureau, built his career on rooting out dishonest officials. He led high-profile investigations, stood on anti-graft podiums, and warned others that no one stands above the law. Behind closed doors, however, Guo was orchestrating a bribery network of his own. An internal audit in 2018 uncovered millions of yuan in unexplained transactions linked to shell companies tied to his family. Investigators traced luxury properties and overseas accounts, all quietly accumulated while Guo publicly condemned the very crimes he was committing. When the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection confronted him, Guo reportedly admitted, "I thought I was untouchable." His fall was swift. Convicted of abuse of power and bribery, Guo received a life sentence. The case made national headlines not just for the hypocrisy, but for what it revealed, that even in a system designed to purge corruption, corruption had burrowed its way to the top. Javed Iqbal fallout. Pakistan's police failure. In Pakistan, the name Javed Iqbal remains synonymous with horror. Between 1998 and 1999, Iqbal confessed to killing over 100 children in Lahore, a crime so gruesome that it forced the entire country to confront its policing failures. For months, parents of missing boys had begged local authorities to investigate disappearances. Instead, their pleas were ignored. Many were told their children had run away or had been recruited into street gangs. Only after Iqbal mailed a confession letter, detailing his crimes and providing proof, did the truth surface. The fallout exposed a devastating chain of negligence, officers who lost reports, stations that refused to register missing person cases, and a bureaucracy more focused on maintaining its image than protecting its citizens. While Iqbal himself died in custody before his execution could be carried out, the scandal forced Pakistan's police to overhaul its child protection protocols. Hotlines, centralized databases, and specialized child crime units were born from that tragedy. 3 stories, 1 pattern. From Qatari's wartime cruelty to Guo Ping's corruption to Pakistan's systemic neglect, each case shows that authority, when left unchecked, becomes its own kind of crime scene. In every nation, the badge, the office, the title, these symbols only mean something when they serve others, not the self. Once that balance tips, the result is universal, suffering hidden behind bureaucracy, and justice that arrives too late. Across every story, from Gerard Schaefer's swamp hunts to John Burge's torture chambers, from Antoinette Frank's betrayal of the badge to Wayne Sanderson's forged justice, one thread binds them all: the moment when law stopped protecting and started preying. These were not outlaws hiding in shadows. They were men and women entrusted with the light, the ones sworn to protect, to serve, to stand between chaos and order. And when they fell, they didn't just break laws. They broke trust, the invisible backbone of justice itself. When enforcers become offenders, the damage runs deeper than any single crime scene. Every uniform, every courtroom, every prison cell carries the echo. Victims stop believing in rescue. Families stop calling for help. Communities begin to see authority not as a shield, but as a threat. The line between justice and fear blurs until even innocence feels unsafe. Unchecked power rarely begins with evil intent. It starts with small privileges, the extra access, the blind loyalty, the we handle our own silence that grows inside every institution. Over time, accountability becomes optional. Loyalty replaces integrity. And when that happens, the badge, that simple piece of metal meant to symbolize courage, becomes a mask for something far more dangerous: impunity. Inside police stations, silence often sounds like professionalism. Don't question your partner. Don't talk to outsiders. Don't embarrass the department. But behind those mantras lie decades of untold stories. The officers who saw misconduct and stayed quiet. The supervisors who looked away. The leaders who prioritized reputation over truth. The cost of that silence is measured not in headlines but in lives ruined, evidence tainted, and faith shattered. The collapse of public trust is not a sudden event, it's erosion. Every cover-up, every falsified report, every time a victim's voice is dismissed, it chips away at the foundation of belief that justice can be fair. And when that foundation crumbles, even the innocent begin to see law enforcement not as saviors, but as systems built to protect themselves first. Yet these stories, grim as they are, serve a purpose. Each exposure, each whistleblower, each trial, each name added to history's dark ledger, forces society to confront its own complicity. To ask how oversight failed, how training failed, how culture failed. Because corruption doesn't thrive in darkness alone, it thrives in denial. Across continents, the same lessons repeat. Absolute power without absolute accountability leads to decay. Whether it's a police commander in Chicago torturing suspects, a detective in Britain fabricating evidence, or an officer in China caught in his own corruption web, the pattern remains painfully familiar. Authority, when unchecked, turns inward. For the public, justice is more than punishment. It's faith. Faith that the law will treat every person equally. When that faith is broken, society doesn't just lose trust, it loses direction. And rebuilding that faith takes generations, not policies. So as the final names fade from this chronicle of betrayal, one truth remains clear. A badge, a uniform, a title, they mean nothing without accountability. Justice, in the wrong hands, becomes its own crime. Because when protectors turn predators, law itself becomes the weapon. And when that happens, justice doesn't die loudly. It dies quietly, in the silence of those who saw it and chose not to speak.